Hello, everybody. I'm Jean Latting. What kind of moral dilemmas do you face in your work, and how do you resolve them? I am delighted to introduce you to Rod McCowan, whose work focuses on preparing principled leaders who will make a difference in the world. Rod holds a PhD and is an associate professor of organization and management at Emory University. He also heads up his own coaching and consulting firm. He has a number of honors that you can read about in his bio. A mutual friend introduced us, and after that conversation, I knew I wanted to bring him to this podcast. Here he is telling us how he prepares principled leaders to make a difference. Hi, Rod.
Hi, Jean. How are you?
I am fine and so delighted to have you. I have in front of me your bio, which says that you're an associate professor in the practice of organization and management at Emory University, which is in my home state, as you may or may not remember. And what you said in your bio that intrigued me tremendously is where I really want to begin. I feel incredibly blessed to have the opportunity to teach at Guazetta, given the high caliber of faculty and students and how strongly my purpose and values align with this mission of preparing principled leaders who will make a difference in the world. Mm-hmm. So my first question to you is, what is a principled leader?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Look, I guess the way that I think about it is this. Anytime leadership exists everywhere. So we're never at a loss for leaders. There will always be leaders. The moment you get two human beings together, leadership starts to happen, whether it's mutual or in one direction. So leadership itself is sort of amoral. It's like a gun. It can either be used for good or be used for bad. And so principled leadership, in my mind, is when you then apply the moral dimension to leadership. And you said that, you know what, as a leader, there's a right way to lead and there's a wrong way to lead. There's a right way to interact with people and a wrong way to interact with people. And when faced with a particular challenge or issue, there is a right answer and there are wrong answers. And even though I don't necessarily believe that kind of moral certitude is always possible, because many of the things that leaders are faced with are gray rather than black or white, I do think it matters that the leader has a moral compass or a moral impulse and is trying at all times to do the right thing. That's what I think we have a dearth of in this world, and we need more organizations that are led by principled leaders, and we need more leaders who commit to evolving their moral compass so that they can lead through complex moral dilemmas in a more sophisticated and effective manner.
Okay, so let's break this down. Give me an example of any dilemma, and you can take your time with this. Mm-hmm. Give me an example of any dilemma where a leader has a moral choice, and just play that out so we can see what you're talking about.
Okay, for example, in an organization, you're deciding as the leader what the strategy should be. What the strategic direction of this particular organization should be, or said differently, how this organization needs to adapt itself in this moment. That's all we mean by strategy. The moment you start talking like that, you automatically are talking about how your strategic direction is going to impact human beings inside the organization, outside the organization. So right there, without going a step further, you are now in the moral dimension, because if it affects other human beings, there's a right way to affect them. There's a wrong way to affect them. You can cause bad things to happen to them. You can cause good things to happen to them. So even setting strategy, especially setting strategy, has moral implications for the various stakeholders that make up the ecosystem surrounding that organization.
Okay, so I just read this article yesterday by David Brooks in the Atlantic. I don't know if you read it, on how it was entitled, "Why Have Americans Gotten So Mean?" And his argument was that we live in a time now where there's no morals are not being taught. Civics are not being taught. The things, the institutions that used to provide morals for young people are no longer there or breaking apart. And we moved into the area where what feels good to me must be good because it feels good to me. So the question I'm trying to ask you is, how does a person determine what is the moral thing to do? How do they even make a moral choice?
No, it's a great question. And by the way, I agree with David Brooks' thesis there, that this is one of the great both tragedies and sort of growing realities of our time. It is that people rise into organizations and into positions of leadership without the sort of opportunities for moral character formulation or formation at early stages of their lives, let alone learning how to reason their way through complex moral dilemmas effectively. How do I start to practice that in my day-to-day leadership?
Yeah, well, and let's talk about Jim. Let's make Jim, just think of one of your clients, one of your students, anybody, Jim, and put Jim in a situation and have him reason that through.
Yeah. So let's say, so I'm thinking about a client right now, and we're going to call him Mike.
Okay.
And Mike's CEO of a company. And Mike has been given a mandate by the board to turn around the economic performance of the board because they've been leading in their industry, but they've been destroying economic value. So the bottom line isn't what it is. And so shareholders are restless or getting upset with them. And so Mike has to figure out then what he's going to do about that. They're burning through so much money that it's eating away their profitability. Okay. And shareholder, and so they're not meeting the street's expectation for profit. The amount that's left over after you take all those expenses away from whatever revenue you're coming in. It doesn't matter if you're making top line revenue, if you're not efficient enough in your internal processes to ensure that as much of that possible is translated into profit, which is then a reward to your shareholders.
Okay. Okay.
So his job is to restore profitability to the company. He didn't, the top line was there, but the profitability wasn't there because we're eating too much cost.
Okay.
It turns out that Mike concludes that in order to achieve the turnaround in the company, three things have to happen. One, he has to take cost out of the business. So he has to, and he can do that just top down, or he can approach that one in a way that engages the participation of all of the employees in the organization and gets everyone collectively yanking costs, trying to find ways to make processes more efficient, make offices more efficient, make everything more efficient so that they're extracting as much cost out of the system as possible. Every dollar of cost that they take out is a dollar of increased profitability for the company. So, and what Mike chooses, because Mike is both because Mike wants to succeed, but also because Mike is a principled leader, is he chooses a both and. He doesn't abdicate responsibility, moral accountability for finding the right answer and figuring out how to yank the cost out the system, but rather than treating the people of his organization just as cogs in a machine that he can just command and they comply, he recognizes that he has extraordinary talent in that group of human beings, and that if motivated correctly, they can do amazing things. And so he approaches them in a way that engages their participation and involves them in the hunt for costs that can be yanked out of the system or ways to make the organization more efficient. So that's one thing he can do. But then what Mike also realizes as he's trying to figure out how to meet the board's mandate to restore the profitability of the company is he realizes that he's got a cultural problem, an ideological problem, which is to say that the company has been so successful in the past that the employees and the company was such a good corporate citizen in terms of contributing to good social causes and things like that, like trying to be more green, et cetera, that the employees have kind of over time come to treat the company almost like its primary purpose for being is to be a nonprofit, sort of quasi-social oriented organization rather than a for-profit enterprise.
Whoa, hang on a minute. Okay, I just got to absorb that because I can imagine some people cringing at that. I have a large contingent. I'm a social worker, so a large contingent of our organization, of my those who are affiliates of Leading Consciously, are nonprofits. So what you're saying is, if it's a business and it exists for profit, then if it gets too oriented towards charity, towards the community, towards giving, that can be a problem.
That's right. What you want is, so let's, I love what you just did. So let me back up just a second and say it this way. We have three sectors of society, and Bella et al. Argued years ago in their phenomenal work, The Good Society, that there can be no collective quest to create a better society that doesn't involve in helping the institutions in all three sectors perform at higher and higher levels, which is to say that the modern world is a world in which all human life is mediated by institutions, by large scale institutions. From the time we're born in a hospital and we get buried by a burial home, everything in between, we go to school, our lives are mitigated by institutions, and therefore the performance of those institutions matters in all three sectors. And each sector, the organizations pursue a different type of objective function. For-profit organizations have a different objective function than not-for-profit or public sector organizations. No one is better than or worse than the other two. Rather, each one is important to our collective, because we need for-profit enterprises that are bringing innovative products into the world. They would not be motivated to do that if it were not for the opportunity to earn a profit and do it. We need public sector organizations that are trying to govern people more fairly, more effectively, et cetera, and provide for the common defense, provide for the common welfare. And we need not-for-profit organizations that go and then take on social issues that the public sector and the private sector organizations aren't equipped to address. But no matter which sector in, the leadership of that particular organization, their primary moral, and I mean moral obligation, not just an economic one. If I'm a leader of a for-profit organization, I have a moral obligation to manage the assets that have been put at my disposal in a manner that is going to redound to the benefit of all of my corporation's shareholders and stakeholders. And what I'm saying is that an outstanding principled corporation, or for-profit corporation that we all should be proud of, is one that doesn't treat profit as a dirty thing. Because sorry, I think that Adam Smith kind of won that argument between him and Karl Marx into which of these systems creates better human flourishing and thriving and so forth. I think capitalism does, but not like pure laissez-faire capitalism. History shows that if you let people pursue unbridled capitalism, they will do great umbrage to large swaths of their fellow human beings and will not care about it.
Okay, so you covered a whole bunch of stuff, and I wanted to make sure each point, as I can remember them, is covered. First of all, there are three sectors, and it's interesting because the three sectors, as I would put it, would be for-profit, government, and nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And the nonprofit is really technically private nonprofit, because government is nonprofit also. But you're distinguishing between government and private nonprofit that has its own separate board, whereas government is accountable to the taxpayers. That's
right. And government is also accountable to the political system, is ultimately run by the political system in a way that private nonprofits are not.
Wow. Okay.
So I think of private nonprofits as being right in between for-profit and government, in that they share more of the sort of pure social mission of public sector, good human welfare, directly speaking, if you will, although I think that does an injustice to say it that way to the for-profit, because some of these for-profit enterprises, like hospitals or whatever, are directly involved in improving the quality of human life. But then in terms of their operations, they act more like for-profit organizations. They're scaled more like for-profit startups. They grow like for-profits. They conduct themselves like for-profits. Their governance systems are more like for-profits in that they have a board of directors that oversees them. Their stakeholder network looks more similar to for-profits than it does to government. Government, to me, is a very different beast to the other. Again, I think people make too much about the distinctions between the three, at least when it comes to leadership, when it comes to, they all have objective. There are certain things that are universally true. They all have objective functions. They all have leadership. They all depend on talent. They all depend on training. They all depend. So all in that sense, they're the same. But in terms of the nature of their objective function and the nature of their governance and the nature of their operations, that's where the three differ. And then Mike and the team around him is going to ask, okay, set that aside. Now, if we look at this strategy and we ask ourselves, if we were creating an organization from scratch, what values would we want the organization to have to execute this strategy brilliantly? In other words, what would the ideal set of organizational values look like for an organization consecrated to executing this particular strategy or pursuing this mission? And then once we have that short list, and we're going to limit ourselves.
I'm confused. We got the values, then we look at the strategy, and we say which of the existing values or what new values are we bringing in? Should we bring in?
The question you have to answer, and that Mike's trying to answer here, is, do I have an organization whose culture and core values is already fit for purpose to do what we need to do next?
Duh.
It's always about what are we trying to do next? And do we have an org that's ready, that's fit for purpose to execute that strategy? If we do not, then the first task of leadership is to start modifying the org to make it fit for purpose, to execute the strategy that we need to execute to win in the marketplace or deliver our maximum impact to the world. And what we know from those, the world of systems thinking, is that the most powerful way to intervene in a system to change it is not at the level of quantitative metrics like numbers or dollars and cents. It's at the level of concepts and ideas and ideology and values. If you want to change a system, you start there first. Because if you can get everybody to align around the target values, culture, that sort of intangible stuff, then the rest of it is derivative from that. Now you can empower them to go start working in all these different units without you being there. But because you all have done a Vulcan mind meld around the values and the North Star, if you will, you can now trust them to go do the work that they need to do. But you got to start with the values. And what Mike realized pretty quickly, or the team working with Mike helped Mike realize pretty quickly, is that over time, the values that the organization have drifted to were only in part fit for purpose for the new strategy it had to execute.
Give an example of a value that's not fit for purpose in this case.
So the perfect example of that, and then now this brings us, I know this has been a little convoluted, but now we can get right to it. It turns out that it's not that commitment to community and to society was wrong. It's that was only part of the story. And what the organization had drifted to was a place where it did not respect the fact that shareholders are a part of that community or society, and that therefore the needs and wants and interests of shareholders did matter, especially because as a for-profit enterprise, what the company had done, like most for-profit publicly held for-profit enterprises, is at some point it went to the world, went to the market, and it said, we need investment in order to fund the continual growth and scaling of our enterprise. And we would like you to park your dollars with us, invest. We know you have thousands of other investments that you could make with your money, other institutions you could invest in, but we believe you should invest in ours because we're going to give you a whatever superior return on your investment. But then having made that ask, and after companies or individual investor and institutional investors had said yes and had given the company money, the company was then behaving as though it didn't owe a debt, didn't owe an obligation, a moral obligation to those investors. So it's making money, but the employees are viewing it as a pure social benefit organization. So it should be all about society. And they thought of the very customers or the very people that were investing in them in more evil or less than positive terms, that there was something bad about it.
Argument for capitalism in the most refined way that I can remember hearing.
Well, but think about it. When we say capitalism, like when we say investors, the boogeyman of capitalism, when we say investors, there's retired teachers on pension funds whose livelihood, whose ability to take care of themselves in their retirement years depend on the companies that make up the fund that their pension is invested in performing well. If those for-profit enterprises perform well, that teacher gets higher return from that pension fund investment and has more to live on. And that's just the beginning of it. We all, most of us, are dependent on this capitalist system for our ability to take care of the things at the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We get jobs from them. We get goods. We make income. We get technologies that improve life. We use the technologies that these companies produce to help our own organizations and businesses perform. So it's all, as King said, when in his letter from a Birmingham jail, when he wrote about us all being part of this inextricable web of connection, etc. That's exactly what I'm referring to, and I think that's what Bella et al. in the Good Society referring to when they say all institutions matter. You don't have the luxury, if you really do care about the collective good of our species, you can't sit in one sector and turn your nose up at the other sectors or act like the other sectors, what happens in them don't matter. It's too interconnected for that. Matter of fact, most of the major problems that face us defy single sector solutions. They almost always involve tri-sector solutions. The sectors collaborating, each doing their part, et cetera, et cetera. So come back to Mike. With Mike, it's just a similar recognition that if he wants to achieve something concrete, like lowering the cost structure of the organization, he has to approach it in a multi-dimensional way that doesn't just look at concrete things like systems and processes and dollars and cents, but also looks at intangible things like ideas, ideology, hearts, minds, souls, what values, et cetera, et cetera. He's got to pursue an approach that takes into account all those dimensions and starts, to the extent that it's humanly possible, making adjustments in each one of them that then start to move the system in the direction that it needs to go to execute that strategy flawlessly. That's right. He's got to reframe the narrative. And I don't mean that in a manipulative sense.
My book is called Reframing Change. Go ahead.
That's right. That's right. And or said differently, maybe just to use a metaphor, he's got to put the whole enterprise on his back and carry them up to the top of the mountain and let them see the complete data set that he's looking at in terms of the exogenous or the external strategic context, the market, competitors, all of that sort of stuff. And he's got to get them to realize, he's got to remind them who we are as an organization, what our raison d'etre is as an organization. We are a for-profit enterprise that was created to bring a certain type of innovation to the world, so that it would make our clients or customers' lives better by bringing greater functionality, greater beauty, greater whatever into it, etc. And in order to pursue that mission, we need funding. We have a constant need for the funds necessary to expand, add new plants, pursue new technologies, do whatever. And in order to get that funding, we go to, in this world, the way that it works, we go to the market and we ask people to invest. And here's the new thing that I need to remind everyone of. Not new, but the thing I think at this moment in our evolution, we have to remember, when they say yes and they give us those dollars, we now have voluntarily accepted a moral responsibility to do everything legally within our power to return maximum, to provide maximum returns for the trust and investment they have been willing to make in us. And as long as we continue to do that, we honor our side of the contract with this particular stakeholder. And then we have similar contracts with government, with community. So it's not to say that that thing that you all feel, that pride you feel in the role that we play in society is not important. It is absolutely important. Matter of fact, we want to be able to do more of that. But the price to do more of that is to not forget our raison d'etre, not forget why we're here in the first place, not forget where where the revenues of the funds come that allow us to play this wonderful role out there in society. And oh, by the way, even more than that, to realize the honor, the moral value in just delivering superior products to clients at lowest possible cost, and providing, therefore, high returns to our shareholders so that the line of people wanting to invest with us keeps getting bigger and bigger or longer and longer because people love what we're doing. They see that we're excellent stewards of their capital and that the promises we make are promises we keep.
So let me tell you, I'm sitting here thinking, just sort of amazed. A friend of mine, Angela Blanchard, built up a local community center organization. I think it was 3 centers at a time, from something like $1 million to 50 million. 500,000 to 50 million on just what you said. She said to her staff, who did not want to fill out the paperwork, did not want to count the pencils, did not want to fill out the forms. She said, if we don't get funding, we can't exist. And your paperwork, you're telling me I need to be in the community, not filling out bloody paperwork. Your paperwork brings in the dollars so that you can be in the community. So the very thing you just said on the for-profit side shows up on the nonprofit side.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And now just to build on that, let me just connect one other dot, going back to one of your original questions. Why principled leadership?
Right.
So if Mike happened to not be a particularly principled leader, meaning he wasn't well versed in moral theory or moral frameworks or moral concepts or concepts of values, et cetera, he would be underdeveloped for the challenge that Mike faced at that moment. He would be ill-equipped to navigate through, because to convince the enterprise and all of its stakeholders that these changes were necessary, given the nature of as I've described it, of the culture that existed at that time, which was very much a sort of social purpose orientation, et cetera, he was going to have to use that language and convince them based on moral argument, not based on economic or practical argument. I mean, he could bring that in a conceptual way, but he had to be able to do that as well. But even before he could get there, he himself had to be able to sort out right from wrong. Well, what is this the right thing for him to do? And if he didn't have the moral compass, then how is he going to do that well?
So that's what I'm trying to get to. I'm sitting here thinking, do you have a moral framework you teach? Do you have a approach that you use?
So
Go ahead.
yeah, no. So the answer to this, and it may not be a perfect answer. So this is just what one guy sort of has evolved to over time. So one guy who sort of, started out sort of uh, immersed for years in training in moral theory and both at the undergraduate and the graduate level and and religion and all of that sort of stuff. But then who wound up then once he's out in the world in public sector, for-profit sector, not-for-profit sector, realizing just the extraordinary variance in beliefs and belief systems and in
Are we,
moral frameworks and all of that sort of stuff.
are we
So
talking about you?
that's exactly right.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear. Go ahead.
And so what I at some point came to conclude is, as similar to what William James and Ralph Waldo Emerson and the other American transcendentalists came to at some point, is that, chasing truth with a capital T or morality with a capital M is probably not a wise investment of time and energy, just because we differ so much as humans. Who's to say that the Western Judeo-Christian ideology is going to be superior to the Eastern Confucian-based or Buddhist-based or the Middle Eastern Muslim or Islam? And as global corporate, many of these, especially corporations, are by definition global. And meaning that they have employees that represent all of these different things. So it would be inappropriate, or I concluded early on as a leader, inappropriate for me to try to take mine and just dictate that mine is the dominant paradigm and force everyone else to subsume to it. That's not what we're talking about here. Instead, I make a lesser argument. So now call it maybe morality with a small m or truth with a small t, case T, which is that I don't care what your religious or spiritual or whatever dominant belief framework or whatever, or particular moral, whether you're a Kantian and you like Kant's theory of ethics, or you're utilitarianism and you like John Stuart Mill and all of. I don't want to get. We're not gonna get anywhere in the moment we encounter any kind of scale or complexity if we're fixated on any one over the other. But we instead, probably a wiser approach is to, number one, recognize that none of us know for sure. Number two, that every one of us is within our right, as long as we're not hurting anyone else, to choose how we believe and which of these frameworks or systems sort of work best for us. But number three, that the moment we start to come together in community, whether that's just a team, a family, a team, a neighborhood, or a city, a nation, or it's a corporation, or what, the moment we start gathering with others, there is a need to figure out how to reconcile all of this, how we're going to make it all sort of work. And so then that says to me that then whatever your entity is, and then we're talking about a corporation, the corporation is entirely within its right, and in fact is wise, to try to be as explicit about defining what is going to bind us together. How are we going to forge common purpose in the face of our extraordinary diversity? Said differently, given that we all believe so many different things, can we carve out some things we all believe in and are willing to commit to, that will then define us as an organization, as a culture, going forward? And we can refine that over time, for sure. Now, and what should inform that? Well, all of what that we bring to the table. So all these different, the truths or lessons that we've learned from the different major religions, or from the different schools of spirituality, or from the different schools of ethical theory. But now, so that's the big picture answer. The more direct one is at the level that I'm usually working with leaders who have been, educated around a lot of that. So they kind of know that all of that's out there. What I find they find most helpful, because most of them did not take ethics in school, because they didn't go to church, because this wasn't what they talked about at the family dinner table, et cetera, et cetera. What I find helpful to them is a number of folks, researchers or scholars, have done great service in taking the body of our sort of the greatest thinking that the, the knowledge accumulated by those in our species who over history have done the deepest thinking, have devoted themselves to doing deep thinking on what is morality, what is social justice, how should human beings treat each other, what are our mutual obligations. They're researchers who've gone through and looked at history, have identified the folks that did the deepest thinking, and have then synthesized and done a comparison and contrast with that, and now have created really short, condensed articles that give you a pretty quick overview of, okay, when you're faced with a moral dilemma, here are like the 5 major ethical theories that are probably going to be most useful in helping you decode or break down that moral theory. And then what I say to my students is, it's not that I'm not going to say to you, you should use one over or the other, because most of them are only good as far as they go. They have flaws, they have weaknesses, etc. What I say is that, and it's not a perfect answer, but it is the world we live in, circa 2023, and given everything and where our species is at this moment, is the best way to approach it is treat it like when you go to the ophthalmologist or optometrist office because you need a new lens prescription. The optometrist puts you in a chair and puts that thing in front of you and starts switching through lenses, and each time asks you, can you see better or can you see worse? Can you see better or you see worse? That's how I think of these different moral theories. When I'm looking at a difficult or a leader, I'm coaching a leader to look at a particular moral dilemma. It's like, okay, what does utilitarianism say is the right answer here? What does Kantianism say is the right answer here?
You
What
really work them through those theories? You really
and you just sort of you understand how each theory hangs, what makes it work, and then you practice applying them through cases to where it becomes natural for you to literally take on one lens and take off the other. And then every time, if over time, as you get stronger at this, now when you're faced with a moral dilemma, you're rapid fire trying on those different lenses to see which ones are shedding the most light on the dilemma in this particular moment. And you're not done until you've tried all those lenses. And even that probably won't resolve the matter, but at least now you are as fully informed as you can possibly be to now take the thinking of yourself and the others that are sitting in the room with you, and now you guys can go, okay, then Kantianism would say this. So what all these different lenses did is they've now caused you to see something that you saw darkly. You can see it a little more clearly now, the different dimensions of it. What are the obligations that should be honored? What is the moral theory that would justify you doing this act versus that act? And
well, you know what? I have just found why I was so compelled to get you on a podcast. I kept thinking to myself, I don't know why I'm doing this. I like the guy. I think he's got something to say. I'm not, but this morning, what are we going to talk about? I don't know if you know this, but I used to teach social justice theories.
Oh, no, I did not. Okay.
I taught it for several years at the doctoral level.
Okay.
Okay, so
this underscores why the more I learn about you, the more I know I'm talking to a kindred spirit.
What you are saying you do is you help leaders develop strategy and figure out actions by helping them, training them in how to solve moral dilemmas and how to examine problems through moral dilemmas. And you do this by taking them through the major social justice theories.
That's right. Now, and the only differentiation I make, it's an important one, is I've talked about two different, my two primary audiences, my students, the MBAs or executives that I facilitate an executive education program or an MBA core program, and then my executive coaching clients. And the thing I'd say, the reason I'm mentioning this is that my coaching clients, they typically don't have the time to go off and do the deep reading and the deep all of that. So with them, I will literally condense it and just deliver it to them, or give them the education they need right then in the calls, etc. I may send them off to a reading or two, but I'm not gonna make them go too deep. My students, though, who are presumably preparing for careers of leadership, I'll make them do the deeper dive or the broader dive, and I'll make them immerse themselves in the theory for a little bit.
Wow. So you have your 1 or 2 or 3 page handout that you give to your coaches,
That's right.
and
And
then
usually they're like Harvard Business Review articles or Sloan Management Review articles, where again, we know that there's good rigor behind them, the science behind them is solid, et cetera, but they've been they've been taken out of the world of the abstract and the academic and turned into the practitioner language that an operating leader can understand.
okay, now let's do you. I wanted to. I'm looking at the time. Let's talk about you. How did you grow up? How did you handle race? How did you get interested in moral theory? How did you get interested in diversity and inclusion, which we haven't explicitly mentioned, but it's been a theme undergirding this whole conversation.
So I'm going to try to, because I know you are watching the clock, so I'm going to try to do this in the most efficient manner possible. And then you can, ask a follow-on that takes me in any detail. But the net answer to kind of I'm going to open my Johari window, which simply is a phrase that means, I'm going to open up and show you who I am at my core right away, so you don't have to waste any time sort of getting to that. The net for me is that the most seminal moment in my life happened at the age of 19, when after a misspent youth on the streets, involved in petty crime and kind of doing all the things you didn't want a young Black kid or male doing back then out on the streets. My high school sweetheart became pregnant. She decided to have the baby. We're so poor that the only place we could live was in my parents' home. And one night, while everyone else in the house is asleep, I find myself standing over this little newborn baby's crib, looking at this fragile, alien-looking being. Now, again, you're talking about a young thug off the streets now, who's now a father, looking down at this alien being. And for some reason, the question that popped into my mind in the still of the night was, what would happen to him if I died right now? And for whatever reason, my mind then sort of immediately started to, like a mini movie started unfolding, showing him growing up in that town, that small town, trying to find anybody that knew his old man so that he could find out who he came from, who was his father, et cetera, et cetera. And the moment, in that very moment as that started unfolding in my mind, my heart started to sink, because I knew that every single person he found that knew me would have nothing but bad things to say about me, such as how I had lived my life up until that moment, selfishly, just, not cared, no concern for anyone else, no moral compass whatsoever, just out on the streets again, doing everything wrong, didn't think I was going to live past 25, didn't care, was just wanted what I wanted, et cetera, et cetera. That moment of recognition seared me with the most acute sense of shame I have ever experienced, either before or since. And the sense of pain was so great that it dropped me to my knees. And as I sat there on the floor on my knees with tears streaming down my face, 2 convictions were born. One, I was never going to let another month or year, month or week go by that I wasn't somehow meaningfully stronger at the end of that period than I was at the beginning of that period. So in other words, I was never going to waste my life again. I was going to consecrate myself to taking whatever I had been given and cultivating it and growing it to the maximum extent possible. I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't even know that I had anything to grow. I just knew that I was not going to waste my life anymore. And then secondly, that on the basis of whatever growth or development I could muster, I was going to forever try to show up on the asset side of society rather than the liability side of society,
right,
to make up for all the negative that I had done, to make up for all the harm that I had done. And so literally Everything that's happened in my life since, everything in my bio, has just been me trying to live out those two convictions from that moment, trying to grow and learn as much as I can. And then on the basis of that learning and growth, trying to make the world a better place, trying to improve. And it just so happened that later in life, the sort of second seminal moment is when I realized that my highest and greatest utilization on the planet, the greatest gift that I believe I can give to our world, is to help leaders become more effective, help leaders with good moral compass, because the last thing I want to do is weaponize bad actors by teaching them to be better leaders. I decided that my sweet spot or hole in the universe was to consecrate the rest of my life to helping leaders with the requisite moral instinct or orientation towards doing right in the world become the best, find their greatness as leaders, become the best leaders they could become, because I believe in the knock-on effect of that great leaders make great organizations, and those great organizations impact the world in really powerful ways. And so that's why, and then you asked about diversity, difference, inclusion, and all of that. Well, number one, as a leader, given the time that I came up with within every organization I was in, I was by definition the highest ranking person of color, which meant I was the chief diversity officer long before anybody had one of those. Which meant that I was the vessel that the different affinity groups in the organization would look to, because of hoping that I could somehow make an unjust system more just for them, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't have any choice. I had to do this work, through most of my 25-year C-suite career. And of course, then when you step off of that and you get into a classroom, you're dealing with the diversity of the world. It looks like, colors of Bennington. And you've got to be able to sort of navigate that as well. And so along the way, now my approach to diversity, equity, inclusion may be a little bit different than most. But given what I've shared with you already, probably isn't surprising, which is I come at it most powerfully through a moral ethical lens. And then I get to but the way I understand it most fundamentally, and the way I help my clients, whether they're majority group members or minority group members, no matter what the form of demographic variance might be, is I say, look, dealing with human variance is inescapable. If you're going to be a leader in today's world, you're going to have to search. It's going to be harder for you to find groups entirely homogeneous.
Right.
Than it will be for you to find groups of variance of some type. And even if the group seems homogeneous based on one or two demographic variables, I guarantee you, if you look beneath the surface, there's all kinds of other variance going on. So human variance, Darwin should have settled this one long. It is the nature of all living things to promulgate more and more variance, more and more, because it's running millions of experiments trying to see which ones, and that's the whole evolution of survival of the fittest, evolutionary theory, all of that explains that. So these, why do we pretend there will ever be anything but variance? So it isn't a question of whether there will be diversity, there will. The question again becomes now a moral one. What do you do about that diversity? How should you interact with people different than you? How should you interact if you're a member of the majority group? How should you, or the dominant or controlling group? How should you interact if you're a member of the majority group or the non-controlling group? How should you interact when you're dealing with someone that's higher ranked than you? How should you interact when you're dealing with someone who's a peer? How should you interact when someone is a subordinate to you in some way or another? How should you interact when that person is in another organization and they're a competitor, or they're in another name? But now we're just completely into sort of this moral realm, and so we can. What I like about approaching it more from this perspective is I find that we've been at, especially like in America, we've been at the black-white thing from the beginning of our existence. As many have said more eloquently than I, it is the original stain on America's history. Slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the challenge with that is we've been at this black-white thing for so long that there's a way in which we, even those of us that are best intentioned, intention, it's so easy to slip into our tribe and just be comfortable in our tribe. And so we may do performative things in terms of relating to the other group, but the moment we're done with work or whatever, we go back off to our segregated worlds, and we don't really sort of interact and so forth and so on. The reality is what we need is something that motivates us to come back to the table and to maybe see this stripped of all the old baggage and see it more fundamentally for what it is, which is souls interacting through their corporeal forms that have all this variance to them in terms of the amount of melanin in the outer, or pigmentation in the outer layer of skin, or biological programming, or the place or locus of our birth, or the amount of wealth that we were born into or not born into, or the way our brains function. All of these sort of distinctions, which should not be a problem. But we humans come along and invest these distinctions with meaning. Now somebody's better than someone else because of the amount or the presence or lack thereof of pigmentation, or because their gender is one thing or another, or their sexual preference. So how do you cut through all of that? For me, what works most powerfully is I return to that moral thing, because the moral dimension to it says this: I don't care what particular prison of demography or circumstance we each were born into. And we all are, the moment our souls get dropped into a corporeal form, that corporeal form is finite and has certain, mine happened to be that of a young Black man born into poverty in a particular place in time, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, each one of us, whatever bundle we get, brings with it certain advantages and certain disadvantages. I will necessarily, whether I'm just a team member or the team leader, make a constant stream of choices about how I'm going to interact with the other members of this team, the other stakeholders in our stakeholder network, and how I'm going to adjudicate dilemmas, how I'm going to decide those dilemmas. And in all of those choices, the choices of how I interact and the choices of how I make those decisions, I can either do moral good or I can do moral bad.
Now, what about the case where a decision will make one group of people think you're doing moral good and another group think you're doing moral bad? So let's go to the Supreme Court that said it's doing moral, that affirmative action is doing moral bad to individuals, and others objected and say affirmative action is doing moral good by overcoming historical barriers. So now what?
Well, and this is where morality really starts to matter, because what in effect, the truth that you're pointing to is that it's not the easy ones. It's not the black and white dilemmas where it's obvious that this is criminal or bad or evil, and it's obvious that this is good or the right thing to do. That's not what trips leaders and organizations up. It's all the gray. It's where you've got, it's what Joseph Badaracco at Harvard refers to as in our defining moments, there's the dirty hands problem. To be a good leader almost invariably means you got to get your hands dirty on some level. And by dirty here, he means you've got competing values or moral objectives. Each one is legitimate. Each one is true. But in certain instances, they're in conflict with each other.
Yes.
So now you've got to decide which way you're going to go. And by definition, you're not giving a clean answer here that someone's going to be harmed, even as somebody's advantage. But that's where the moral theory proves its value. If it's going to ever prove its value, it's how to think that through. Like in an instance where, let's say let's stick with diversity, equity, inclusion. Let's say it's a employee. I remember there's a case that I teach on. It involves at Google. There was a point at which one of the Google engineers wrote a memo to the organization, that basically had very misogynist undertones to it.
Yeah, I remember. He said women weren't fit for high tech, basically.
That's exactly right, because they were going to have babies and they did blah blah blah. He laid out something and he put it out there. and Google, blew up on it. It blew, became a big deal sort of inside the organization. Leadership stepped in and sort of immediately sort of squashed the thing, fired him, did, da, 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 da. My point is, now in that instance, there was what the leadership of Google would have been faced with, and I'm oversimplifying greatly, but what they would have been faced with is utilitarianism would say, what do you do here? You do what's in the best interest of the good of the many, that the good of the many outweighs the good of the one. So forget this engineer, that one person, even if you thought he was right, even if you thought he had an argument, you don't go against the majority, the majority wants X, not that. But then Kantianism would say, so are you saying you're willing to formulate a categorical imperative? That was Kant's test for whether something's good or not, or could be made into a moral principle. And by categorical imperative, it means, would you, if you could of your will, have this apply everywhere in the world? Would, in all instances like this one, all cases, would you categorically want every person to choose to do this thing? If your answer to that is yes, you're on to something. You probably got something that constant rises to the level of a categorical imperative. If your answer to that is no, then you're probably saying, no, this only works situationally. Therefore, it's probably not a strong moral principle or something that you can stand on in that way. So in this case, what would that look like? Do you want dissenting voices silenced everywhere and at all times? Is that a moral principle you would subscribe to? I would argue no, that there are going to be times when that dissenting voice is actually the true voice. It is the voice that is saying the right thing. But in this moment, if you're a leader, which of these two principles are you going to honor? Are you going to respect, as Kant would, the right of that individual to express himself freely? And he's not going out and hurting anybody. All he's doing is in a public arena, he's articulating a particular point of view. Is that a fireable offense? Did it say anywhere in your policies that someone would get fired just for articulating their particular point of view? So right there, you're faced with how are you then going to adjudicate this matter when the different moral theories would lead you maybe to perhaps to different conclusions, and you then have to decide. It's not a question, again, knowing and being comfortable, developing your muscle to reason your way through moral dilemmas isn't going to make you have to deal with less of them or make it any less challenging for you to work your way through to the right answer. It just gives you more tools to at least make as fully informed a decision as you can before you have to reach final conclusion. In that case, they fired him. My students, I've taught that case a few times now, and the students eventually usually come to some that where they messed up is they rushed to satisfy the crowd at Google, and it would have been smarter for them to slow things down, engage people in a more constructive dialogue, because that one guy actually represented a lot of voices within Google. They may not have been the popular voices in a more liberal sort of West Coast Silicon Valley company environment, but nevertheless, they were voices that were worthy of being heard, and there could have been something creative could have emerged out of the tension between the opposing sides on that one. But again, it would have required leadership that was strong enough in their own sort of moral capability or moral reasoning capability to not just respond knee-jerk to the obvious conflict that's presenting itself, but instead could trust their ability to hang in there, facilitate a dialogue a moral dialogue that surfaced all dimensions and angles and arguments that were to be had on that particular topic. And then on the other side of that, what was it, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, I wouldn't give a damn for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give the world for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. This was the Supreme Court justice talking about, working through more difficult cases and so on and so on. And so in this case, what we're talking about is what they could have done if they had facilitated that right, is they could have surfaced all the complexity, worked their way through it, and then found the simplicity on the other side that probably would have honored the right of the dissenting voices to speak up, as long as that led to constructive dialogue or wasn't being weaponized in a destructive way. That's right. And what Ronald Heifetz at Harvard, the Kennedy School, who did him and his colleagues came up with that wonderfully helpful theory of adaptive leadership, where they argue that most of what needs to happen these days is an adaptation, and it's the leaders who are comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity and who can frame the right questions rather than have the right answers. That's a form of act. And so what he would say, to use his language, is that in that what they did there, they cut off the possibility of adaptive work.
Oh, that's so true.
Yeah. Yeah, because they didn't trust the tension. They didn't trust their ability to manage the conflict or the tension in the system. If they did, adaptive leadership requires that you actually make space for the conflict and you allow the heat to actually increase as a way of surfacing the different sides of it, et cetera, et cetera. But only if you do that can you as a group, and I'm including the people that are in the dialogue and the leaders, it's only then do you have a hope of seeing in the midst of what it first presents as maybe paradoxes or conflicts or whatever, finding that both and, finding the way to innovate in a way that honors all sides of the argument, or both sides, and maybe not perfectly, but gets enough of it there to where that particular group of human beings goes, you know what, there's some things that aren't being honored here, but the compromise seems like the fairest compromise under the circumstances. So yes, we will all subscribe to this particular compromise, and now and because we all get something out of it and we all give something to it. E pluribus unum.
This has just been magnificent. It's exceeded my expectations since, as I told you, I came in not sure if I had any, except that I knew that it would be good. And so I want to, any takeaways that you want people listening to get from what you've said?
Yeah, I guess if you really, just to follow that flow of argument, if you boiled it down to one thing, it's to realize, to either awaken, or if you're already awake, feel validated and lean even more heavily into the recognition that we are all born into these sort of metaphorical prisons of demography, of circumstance. Everyone's is different. And if we're lucky, at some point we become aware that we were born into this sort of prison, if you will, of demography and circumstance. And if we're wise or somehow just get really lucky, we actually decide to do something about it. And doing something, the most powerful thing I can recommend for what you can do about it is take advantage of any sources of mastery of moral theory and reasoning. And the theory is not enough. It's learning to apply it, mastering both the foundation and then learning to apply it to real world situations in your personal life and in your professional life. And then as you continue to do it through your reflection, continue working on going deeper and deeper, because I don't think this one ends till the day that we die. And then from that place of greater moral awareness, greater ability to sort of work to see the moral dimension of every situation you're in, strive your best to transcend your prison and meet other people where they are in a way that respects their worth, their dignity, and treats them as equals, in the Martin Buber sense, that honors the I thou and never seeks to be more than equal, doesn't seek to be superior, don't accept being victim or less, maintain that I thou, but do it from that place of full awareness of who you are and your limitations and your strengths, but also a curiosity and a willingness to embrace the right of other people to come from their different places and be willing to work with that, and realize then when you need consensus, it's just a matter of collaboration and working together and coming up with the best consensus you can, not truth with a capital T, not consensus with a capital C, but truth with a small t and consensus with a small c, enough consensus to allow you to, despite your diversity, or to leverage your diversity, but work in concert with each other, whether you're a family, a neighborhood, a team, an organization, a nation, or a species.
Okay, that's magnificent. I'm looking, I'm really, I'm going to ask you this. It's going to lead to another 3 minutes or so, but I really want to do it. Take what you just said and apply it to what a friend of mine told me. She said she's a Black woman in a predominantly white organization. And she said, Jean, as hard as I try, I just don't trust white people.
So number one, if you take just what I just said, so she's an African American woman, from a particular place, of a particular age, of a particular ideological bent, but with a particular set of values, with a particular combination of strengths and weaknesses, with a particular history of lived experiences and encounters with folks from different groups and all of that. So that is reality. All I'm doing is describing reality. And for her, she can take that, and I'm going to infer from your question a certain thing. So I am making an assumption here, but having lived a male version of her experience,
I'm sure this is not new.
I think I'm on safe ground. That's right. At some point in her heart of hearts, and in the quiet hour, when it's just her, she has to acknowledge that she's faced with a choice. The fact of the matter, I'm going to accept, let's stipulate that she is objectively correct, that her lived experience is that the majority, if not all of the white people she has dealt with have been either hostile or in some way, at a minimum, not non-supportive of her as a Black woman. Let's stipulate that is just, it's a reality, even though that might have been some interpretations might have been wrong, some instances people might have been misjudged or what have you. At some point in the quiet of the night, or when, some other moment where she's alone, as the existentialists would tell us, she faces a fundamental choice. Her choice is to say that because of the legitimate negative behavior or treatment she has received, she feels aggrieved. She knows she's right. She knows they're wrong. And she can't take it anymore. She's just done with it. She's had it up to here with all of that. Or, other end of the continuum, she can just forgive them for all that. Just ignore all of that. Christianity, it would be turning the other cheek. It would be, different would say, whatever. And so, or matter of fact, she can buy the sort of white supremacist ideology that she senses is behind a lot of their behavior and mistreatment, and she can internalize that and absorb it as they're right, and she is flawed, she is less than, she is. So those are sort of the opposite ends of the continuum, if you will. All I can offer is, faced with a similar dilemma in critical moments early in my career, I decided that both of those were false choices, that neither one of those was going to be the powerful path forward, that instead the right path was to, even in the face of their injustice, well, number one, for me, it was to acknowledge that there might be some instances along the way where, because of my earlier experiences, I was too quick to judge something as being unjust or motivated by et cetera, when the reality, if I was being honest with myself as a finite human being who did not have all the information in all circumstances, et cetera, I had to acknowledge that, sometimes I think I may be wrong. I may be a little too quick to jump at the sound of a car backfiring and thinking maybe that's a gun shooting, or et cetera. So number one is that. But then number two, it's also to go, But even if I'm not wrong, even if they all wish me ill, if I let that cause me to go to a dark place and to abandon my hope, abandon my ability to, I lose. By definition, I'm done. If I allow myself to slip into victim, even as though that's what, it's another way of ceding my power to them. I've just then given them the power to determine what I'm going to do with my life, what my mindset's going to be, what my sense of why would I do that? They have no good, they bear me no goodwill. Why would I cede to them people who hate my guts because of the color of my skin or whatever? Why would I give them anything over me whatsoever? Right? Unless I believe them, but I don't. And so instead, what I will do now is what I mean by transcend. I will recognize that as a Black man, in her case, as a Black woman in this world, that brings with it certain advantages, it brings with it certain disadvantages. The disadvantages are societally constructed. This group of people treats me different because I have brown skin and they have white skin. Whose problem is that? Well, if they hurt me physically, that is my problem. But if in a world, if we've at least advanced to the point where they are limited in their ability to physically hurt me, et cetera, then whether they hurt my self-esteem, hurt my sense of well-being, hurt my self-concept, that's a choice I get to make. I get to decide. I don't care if you put me on the 50-yard line of a football stadium and you fill that football stadium with white racists and they're all screaming the N-word at me. They only have the power to affect me internally, my soul, my self-concept, my self-worth, if I decide that I think they might have a point, that they might be right, that whatever they're pushing is, and the fact that there's 50,000 of them in the stands doesn't make them right. And so as long as I can stand there and manage my amygdala and control my fight or flight response and keep reminding myself that I don't care. You know what, Rod, is there anybody in here whose opinion you actually value or respect? No, they're all white racists. They're all screaming negative. I know I'm all that. I'm gonna keep rolling with it. So y'all you stand up there yelling all you want to. By the way, really, that's all you got time for is to be out here screaming at me and calling me. By the way, you guys, just dirty little secret. You do realize that the fact that you're here and treating me that way tells me more about you than it does about me.
Amen.
You do realize that means you got a black hole in you that you're trying to fill through superiority to another group of human beings based on something as ignorant as the amount of pigmentation in the outer layer of our skin. Is that really how you roll? Do you need that? Is that what it's going to take for you to feel good in this world? You can't find any other thing to base your sense of self-esteem and self-worth on that? Well, so be it, but it ain't my problem. I'm not going to worry about that, but I'm not letting you crazy if you think I'm letting you affect how I show up. And oh, by the way, you don't get to tell me I can't have this job in this company. In that regard, I'm going to keep coming in here and working. You can fire me if you want to, but I'm going to keep pursuing my career. And I'll get what I need out of this particular transaction or this particular chapter, and then I'll move on to my next chapter.
Hey, you got it, brother. You got it. That's exactly it. I thank you. I'm so glad I took the time to ask you. I thank you. This has been a sheer delight.
My pleasure.
My
pleasure.
How can people get in touch with you if they want to reach you?
The best way, if you go to the Emory Guazetta Business School website and look for Rod McCowan under the faculty, you'll see contact info, and it's got all my contact info in there.
Okay, that's cool. And I'll put it in the notes below. You'll get, I'm just telling to whoever's listening.
And I'm also on LinkedIn, by the way. You can also find me on LinkedIn.
Okay. Well, thank you. This was a heady conversation. I was fascinated to hear Rod's description of how he prepares leaders to think through moral dilemmas. He literally teaches them different theories of morality and social justice, so they have the tools to work through their moral choices. At first, I was flabbergasted by the very thought, but it makes sense. I can imagine that leaders that are willing to do that are so much better equipped to engage in rigorous consideration of a problem rather than flying off the handle with the first answer that comes to mind. I was also captivated with how he described the importance of investors in a business. Yes, many people equate capitalism with greed, but as Rod is telling us, he supports regulated capitalism, not unregulated capitalism. One reason is that it breeds innovation. And while many of us may think of capitalists as people in the back room smoking cigars, capitalism also includes teachers whose pension funds have been invested in businesses. The last moral dilemma I brought up on the spur of the moment. I asked him what to say to an African-American woman who says she just can't trust white people. I asked him because I've been told that multiple times by many people. His answer was to not let ourselves get dragged down by anyone's opinion of us. Don't let them make us abandon our hope or our power or our goodwill or our sense of self. As he talked about this, I thought about Nelson Mandela, who was incarcerated for nearly 3 decades, and after release was elected president of his country. One of Mandela's favorite quotes is this: "Resentment is like drinking poison and hoping it will kill your enemy." Thanks for listening. I'm Jean Latting. Check out our website at www.leadingconsciously.com.